So today is the last day of our sermon series, the Summer on the Mount. We have a special guest here. He's a friend of mine, David Roberts, who's sharing with us today as he wrestles through what is really, I think, theologically called the atonement theory, but just understanding Jesus died, and Christians claim he rose from the dead, and what does that all mean? How does God work through that? And what are different ways people have understood and do understand this today? And so we're in for a treat. Every time I hung out with David on, was it Thursday morning? Thursday morning. And every time I hang out with him, I get really jealous because he's like an intellectual, which you'll see within the first 5 minutes he's way smarter than Aaron. But I just hang on to every word he grasps. I'm like, oh, your mind works in such a great way. Like, why can't my mind work that way? But it's a privilege to have him. He's a very sharp individual, and he's got a great heart. And so as he comes up, would you guys give David a warm One Church welcome here?
Thank you, Aaron. That was generous. Also generous of Aaron is his decision to use a 6-year-old, 20 pounds lighter picture of me for the promo shot. That was an engagement photo, so professionally shot and edited. I'm sorry that I don't really look like that. So actually, this is the first time in a year that I've had the opportunity to preach. And actually, the last time I did preach was at One Church. You guys were still over at the trampoline park. So congratulations on the sweet upgrade. This is nice. Since that time, my family and we have relocated from the Phoenix area to Charlotte, North Carolina. So I live in the South, which is fascinating, especially considering the events of this weekend that Aaron talked about. Just to clarify, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, not Charlottesville, Virginia. They are named after the same duchess or something like that. But no, it's been an adjustment. When I left Phoenix, I was leaving a church context where I was a pastor that was very different than One Church. Very, for lack of a better word, more conservative or more traditional. And so in Charlotte, we are at a church, an amazing church that is much more like One Church when it comes to who is celebrated and who is welcome and how God is discussed and wrestled with. And so that's been incredibly healing, incredibly encouraging for us to be part of a community like that. For me personally, it's also been very difficult. Leaving my last church context for the reasons that I did radically narrowed my ministry job prospects. And so I've spent the last year out of vocational ministry and just kind of wrestling, and there's a certain, Aaron actually kind of disproves this because he's like the most humble guy ever, but prior to meeting Aaron, I would have said that there's a certain ego involved in being someone who gets up here every week and talks and has you guys listen, and so that's been a challenge, just kind of a shot to my own ego and wrestling with what God has for me ministry-wise in the future, and that remains to be seen. I'm very much in a time of transition, a liminal space of sorts, but it is really an honor to be back here with you guys. This community was our refuge for a couple months when we left our last context, and Aaron is a dear friend, and it's been great to get to know a number of you over the last year as well. So, like I said, being in a progressive context is freeing. It's also eye-opening. There's a lot of people, and I'm sure this is true of this church as well, people are kind of in this season of deconstruction. And so you're re-examining, especially if you grew up in the church, you're re-examining a lot of the doctrines and beliefs and theology that maybe you grew up with. And probably the most scrutinized area of theology is probably creation and how it relates to science and evolution and all that stuff. And that's not what we're going to talk about today. However, the second most is probably what Aaron mentioned earlier, is atonement theory. It is a common critique of Christianity that the cross represents a form of divine child abuse, wherein God the Father, and this gets into confusing Christian Trinitarian theology and weird stuff like that, but where God the Father sacrifices his own son to appease his own anger. And if you really start to think about it logically, it really starts to break down and get really uncomfortable. And it can be really triggering for people who have experienced abuse in their own life. And it becomes incredibly problematic, so much so that perhaps even more so than faith and science debates, the theology and the doctrine behind atonement theory leads a lot of people to just give up on Christianity, give up on religion, and leave the church. But I do think it's important for just and generous, open and affirming, progressive Christians, as at least some of us in this room are, that we don't just wallow forever in deconstruction, but at a certain point, the practice of reconstruction, or perhaps since this is the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, yes, I am a nerd, participate in the practice of reforming. The church should always be reforming. And really what Reformation is in my mind is the act of translation, is saying it's not enough to look back on the past and simply discern or figure out what the church or what the apostles or even what Jesus himself said. We need to know those things. But then we need to come together and discern what must we say today. What must we say in light of Charlottesville? What must we say in light of threats of nuclear war? What must we say in light of the marginalization of the LGBTQ community? What must we say today in light of what they said then? And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. Really quickly, I'm going to give you guys a historical survey. This isn't where I want to camp or spend a lot of time, but there's been a lot of theories, that's probably the best word for it, theories about the atonement. And just by way of definition, atonement simply refers to the saving work of Jesus in his life, death, and resurrection. And throughout Christian history, throughout church history, it's been generally accepted that in some way, particularly the cross and resurrection, but the life as well, in some way, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus saves us. However, there has been no consensus at any point in church history as to exactly how the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus saves us, nor has there been any consensus as to precisely what we are being saved from: sin, maybe Satan, death, but even that gets a little fuzzy and a little squishy. And then I want to add, there's not ever been a consensus as to what we are saved for. Heaven, resurrection, but I don't really think that fully encompasses it as well. In fact, I want to even go so far as to suggest that within the Bible itself, there are different, not necessarily mutually exclusive, but different atonement theories being presented. If you look at the synoptic Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see a big emphasis on some of the political backdrops that the Jewish people in ancient Israel were experiencing at the time with Roman occupation, and those Gospels were probably written around or even soon after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman Empire. And so that is front and center when it comes to ideas of salvation and what are we being saved from. It's a very apocalyptic, because their world was coming to an end, but very political, very kind of this world idea. Hop to the Gospel of John, and all of a sudden, and this gospel was probably written quite a bit later, you get this very present, very completed, very almost existential view of salvation. It's more about something that God has spoken into our lives, into our identities, kind of irrespective of politics or even the future and heaven and things like that. Jump to the book of Acts, and the focus is almost entirely on the resurrection. Anytime you see the gospel presented by the apostles in Acts, they kind of just acknowledge the crucifixion as a given, and they focus on the resurrection of Jesus. And then you get the rest of the New Testament. You got Paul and some of the people who pretended to be Paul when they wrote, and he's all over the place. You hear the crucifixion, you hear the resurrection, there's future, there's present, and it seems almost as if Paul is kind of just throwing a lot of things against the wall and seeing what sticks. And I don't say that to undermine the authority of Scripture. I actually think this kaleidoscope, this kind of multi-perspective view is incredibly important, because to understand the atonement is to understand something that is quite simply the revelation of God, God revealing who he or she perhaps is, God revealing God's self in relation to us and in relation to the way that we relate to one another. And so, real quick, kind of three, and I'll have this up on the screen for you, three kind of dominant atonement theories in the past. Christus Victor, this is the idea that somehow in the death and resurrection of Jesus, evil is overcome, sin, death, Satan is overcome. Sometimes you see a kind of a ransom idea in this. If you've ever seen or read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Chronicles of Narnia, you kind of see this great exchange where Satan in Narnia, that's the White Witch, is sort of baited into this situation, and Christ or Aslan, kind of sacrifices himself, but gotcha. It turns out that actually defeated evil, and this is kind of maybe the dominant understanding or theory in kind of the early church. Throughout the 2,000-year history of the church, this idea of a moral exemplar, whereas Christ is our great example, has kind of always been present, if not as the dominant theory, as kind of a supplementary theory that kind of can help explain things. And then since the Reformation era, there's been this idea of substitution, this idea that God died, Christ died in our place. And there are, I'll just kind of betray my own biases here, there are good versions of this theory, and then there are bad versions, in my opinion, just my opinion, of this theory, and that's where the penal or penalty comes in, the idea that, and this is where some of the ideas about divine child abuse come in, the idea that God actually poured out his wrath on his son in some sort of weird exchange and stuff like that. These are all interesting, and we could spend literally hours up here. This was more of a college class or a seminary course or something like that, getting into the history and the nuances and some of the different advocates of these theories. I'm not going to do that. I don't think that would be helpful for us right now, but I will have some resources at the end of some great accessible books that I think will go into some of these and some of the history of atonement theory a little more detail if you, like me, would be edified by reading books and stuff like that. But instead, I want to talk about what atonement means for us today. I mentioned the word translation a couple minutes ago, and so I kind of want to just frame this for us. The Bible was written a long time ago. And as a Christian, I believe that in some sense, the Bible bears witness to God, it bears witness to divine revelation. It bears witness to people who encountered God in their own times and places. But I also believe that the Bible reflects its own time and place. And so what I don't want to suggest is that as we're trying to understand the atonement, as we're trying to understand how God saves us, I don't want to suggest that we just pick and choose what we like and what we don't like and stuff like that. I don't think that's really helpful to anyone. However, I also don't want to suggest that in order to understand the Bible, we have to put on the same mind as the people who were around when it was written. Because we don't live in their times. We don't share their assumptions about the world. We are in a radically different culture. Kind of a word I like to use is world picture. The uncritical assumptions that we have about the world that we just kind of take for granted are radically different now than they were then. The people in this room are also dealing with a completely different social kind of framework than they were. We live in the United States of America, so we live in an empire. They were occupied by an empire. And that's an important distinction to make. Our perspective on God's saving work is going to be different when you're in a position of privilege. And there are people in this room who are more and less privileged than others, but to some degree, I want to be careful here, but I would venture to guess that on some level, everyone in this room, just by virtue of the fact that we have technology and just some of the scientific advances that we've been blessed with, and the fact that we live in this country, have a level of privilege and power that would have been foreign to the authors and probably the original audience of much of Scripture. And those are important distinctions to make when we are translating the way God revealed himself in the past and trying to understand our own experiences of the divine in the here and now. And so that brings us to the question, so how do we understand the atonement for us today? I have a quote. It makes it look like on this next slide that it's a quote from someone else. This is literally just a quote from me that I wrote in my outline, and Aaron made it look like that. But atonement and therefore salvation, because that's really what this is about. What are we being saved from? What are we being saved for? So atonement. So I'm going to use atonement and salvation kind of interchangeably as I go forward here. But atonement and therefore salvation is ultimately about a right posture towards God, a right posture towards self, and a right posture towards others. And the reason I say that is because if you think about religion today, really it's about those three categories. First and foremost, we live in a society where, at least in some sectors, science for many people has made God obsolete, if not dead entirely. Especially the hard sciences when we're talking about creation science and even sciences about neurobiology and consciousness and stuff like that. More and more, you're hearing people say that you don't really need God anymore. God is, this kind of this God of the gaps argument, and so science has rendered God obsolete. So on one hand, we have to speak to that. When it comes to self, so much of faith expression in the here and now and in our present day speaks to, it kind of gets a little self-helpy. It's all about, dealing with stress, and God almost becomes a sort of three-step program in order to, be as happy as you can possibly be, or have the best kids, or, get them into the best school, or, have the best marriage. And I don't want to suggest to you that your spirituality and your faith cannot speak into those areas, but I want to suggest that maybe there's something deeper there as well. And then when it comes to others, I think that one should be quite obvious. On one hand, we live in the most interconnected world in history. Technologically, we can fly anywhere, we can FaceTime, and we have Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all that fun stuff. And yet, studies repeatedly show that at the same time, there's this sense that we have never been more divided, politically, ideologically. The events of this past weekend, I think, tragically speak to that. The degree to which there are deep, deep, visible, felt, tangible divisions, not just within our world, but within our society, within the church even. Make no mistake, a lot of the people who are marching with torches this weekend are sitting in pews in churches this morning, and they feel perfectly normal about that. We need to have something to say to that. And I actually think atonement theory speaks to that a little bit. And so, like I said, I want to look at these three categories. Don't consider this comprehensive in any sense of the word. This is a sketch. These are things that I've been wrestling with, and I am mostly ripping off people who are far smarter than I am in what follows. But let's start out with God, as we should, because we're in church. Real quick, I want to read a passage from Mark chapter 15. This is a passage in the crucifixion. It'll be on the screen. It says this, verse 33, when it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, I think. I haven't gotten to that part of seminary yet. Which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was God's son. Just go ahead and leave this up here while I do this next part. So, Christians believe that the cross, the crucifixion, reveals something true about God. And there's a smart philosopher-type guy, his name's Peter Rollins, and he writes a lot about this because he's convinced, and I agree with him, that too often throughout history, but we do this a lot in our modern society, modern church as well, too often we have this objectifying, idolatrous view of God. Basically, we imagine God on some level to be this wish-granting genie who is there to sort of kind of make our lives better, and we kind of project our needs and our wants especially onto God. But on the other hand, we kind of imagine this idealized human, this super being, this almost Zeus-like kind of construction where God is off somewhere in the sky and very human in the way that God relates to us. And so we kind of have these simultaneous, I'm going to call them projections about who God is. And this isn't unique to us. In fact, the people of Jesus' time also had very strong projections about who God is and who God was here for and whose side God was on and all sorts of stuff like this. And I think what is perhaps most powerful, and Mark's gospel has my favorite kind of framing of this, which is why I chose it for this part of the message, but I think what we see in the crucifixion is the putting to death, first and foremost, the putting to death of our projections about God. And to some degree, and I want to be careful how I phrase this because this could throw some people, but to some degree it was putting to death of Jesus' projections about God as well. As he cries, my God, why have you forsaken me? The expectation, the picture of God back then was that if God was real, if your God was the true God, then this God would save you. This God would bring you down from that cross. And I can't speak to whether or not how much Jesus knew or understood the big picture, but that was definitely what the people mocking Jesus and around him were mocking him about and encouraging him to do. If your God is real, then why isn't he bringing you down off this cross? And so in this moment, we see that Jesus dies a death in God abandonment. And I think that's important. We want to jump quickly to the resurrection and be like, oh, but surprise, God was there all the time. But I think it's important for us to kind of rest in this abandonment for a minute, because as Christians, we don't just believe that Jesus in some sort of weird abstract way reveals who God is. We believe that Jesus in his life, death, and resurrection reveals who God is. And so in some sense, this is God. This solidarity, this presence in this moment of complete abandonment, forsakenment, dereliction. And I think it's incredibly important that it talks about that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the way Peter Rollins frames this is in his most recent book, he kind of compares it to a magic trick. And if you've seen the movie Prestige, the Christopher Nolan movie, he kind of explains kind of the three stages of a magic trick. And so first you have the pledge. And in our example here, the pledge is your biases, your projections, your objectifications of who God is. And all of us have these. All of us have these. We kind of come into our discussions of God and we have this idea of who God is. Then you have the turn. That's the crucifixion. Your idea, your projection, your assumption is literally put to death. And for most of us, that's not willingly. It might be a life circumstance. It might be a moment of suffering, a massive transition or a life change. But the way we expected God to work, and subsequently the way we expected our life to work, dies. And then the prestige, the resurrection, is our idea is reborn, but in a new way it looks different. And I think it's really important to remember that when Jesus resurrected, kind of the ways that he revealed himself were kind of bizarre. He wasn't immediately recognized. He often took the form of a stranger who appeared to people on the road. When Thomas saw them, he retained his scars of his past life. And so there's this sense where even the resurrected Jesus still shows the scars of the sort of solidarity, the death in God abandonment, where God revealed himself on the cross. So there's a lot of different ways you can take this, but what I kind of want to leave you with when it comes to God first is, if the atonement is anything for us now, it first and foremost needs to be the putting to death of our objectifying projection views of God and allowing God to reveal himself, herself, God's self, allowing the divine to reveal the divine in the lowest moments, in the moments where we least expect God to appear. And when God does appear, allow God to appear as an act of solidarity, as a presence of solidarity, and not necessarily in the ways that we would dictate that God reveal God's self in those moments. Free God to be God and not a projection of what we want God to be. And that brings us to self. I want to read a passage from Galatians real quick. It's Galatians 2, verse 17. It says, this is Paul talking. It says, "But if in our effort to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have been found to be sinners, is Christ then a servant of sin? Certainly not. But if I build up again the very things that I once tore down, then I demonstrate that I am a transgressor. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. This is the key part, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself up for me." So I don't know whether it's a human, a modern thing, a merely American thing, but at least in our culture, at least in American culture, I'll just speak from my experience, we have this drive to secure our identity, to take hold of who we are and be the ones who are in charge of our life on some sort of individual level. Our identity is ours to command, to take hold of, and to secure. And we do this through our vocation, through our work, through the accumulation of wealth. We do this through our families by objectifying our families, often with the best of intentions, but in our children and living vicariously through them. We do this through our education, through our accomplishments, and in the past and in Jesus' time, a lot of this was secured through your religious or cultural or ethnic involvement. And I think once again, the events of this weekend show that sentiment is returning. People are looking to secure their identity in a certain heritage or in a certain history, but we have this tendency to want to take control of our identity. And a friend of mine, a theologian, his name's David Congdon. He's the one who I stole this sermon title from. It's the cover of his book that you see on the slide that says "The God Who Saves." But he, in a recent book, he describes salvation as this divine unsettling, where those attempts on our part to secure our identity in something that we can control, that we can master, are put to death. It's an act of co-crucifixion, being placed outside of yourself. And in those moments, placing your identity and your security completely on God. And this isn't a new progressive idea. Plenty of churches talk about this all the time, but it quickly gets kind of shoved under the rug in place of some sort of like future hope or heaven or something like that. But I want us to camp here for a second, because I think this is a powerful idea, this idea that we are saved from ourselves when we're saved. We are saved from, and I'm quoting David Congdon here, we are saved from the illusion that we belong to ourselves, from our anxious attempts to secure ourselves, from our desire to possess our identity, and thus our future, from the struggle to assert our freedom and authority. God interrupts our existence and places us outside ourselves, thus making us wholly insecure in ourselves, but wholly secure in God. It's a weird idea. This idea that to be saved, we actually have to first be unsettled, that we have to be stripped of our attempts to save ourselves, so that in those moments, those low moments, we are wholly in God's hands. But I think that's what Paul's talking about here in Galatians when he says, I've been crucified with Christ. It's not I who live in the flesh. He's talking about the law. The law was the people's attempts to secure their identity, to secure their righteousness, to take hold of their future for themselves. And the cross of Christ strips us of that, and it frees us. It frees us to be wholly dependent on God. And that actually opens us up to be wholly for others. So if salvation is first and foremost a right view of God, the putting to death of our projections and our idolatries about God, it is second, a putting to death of our attempts to secure our identity, freeing us up to be wholly dependent on God, and therefore radically open to those around us, to others, to the other, those who are radically different from us. Which brings us to our final passage, Matthew 25. Starting in verse 34, it says this, Then the king, this is Jesus talking, he says, Then the king will say to those at his right hand, Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you guys actually have this on a little bulletin board out there. For I was hungry, and you gave me some food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king, God, Jesus, will answer them, Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me. So a couple things here. First and foremost, and Aaron already beautifully kind of set this up, we see that the default position of God, of Jesus in this passage, is on the side of the oppressed. That's just a given. So the first thing I want to suggest when it comes to others is that, if to be saved is to be a Christian, is to be placed outside of yourself, is to be stripped of your attempts to secure your identity in your own accomplishments, in your own abilities or skills, and to be made wholly reliant on God, then the marginalized, by this definition, are saved, are Christians by default. Which is kind of a weird idea for those of us who grew up in church and constantly needing to go evangelize and convert other people and stuff like that. And perhaps there's a time and a place for that. But I want to unsettle us here today by suggesting that those people who you think need Jesus most of all are actually perhaps your very means of salvation. Because they are already in a position of dereliction. They are already in a position of God, of apparent God-forsakenness, and therefore are actually already wholly secure in God's love. And rather than convert them, it is in fact you who needed to be converted, not simply or merely in charity, but converted in solidarity with them. And this is where it's really important to remember that we in the United States in the 21st century live in a position of power and a position of privilege. Because so often we are in position not to, we are in position to put ourselves in their shoes. We are in position to take on their identity, not try to convert them to some more holy or divine or righteous identity that we have kind of decided for them. And so our posture towards others should be the same as that of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I want to have a couple quotes from him in a second, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born into massive privilege. He was an incredibly wealthy family. The expectation was that he would go on to do something in medicine or in politics, and he actually greatly shamed his family by choosing to be a minister. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer's primary formation didn't take place in pre-Nazi Germany. It actually took place because he spent a year in the United States living in Harlem, New York, and he spent time. He was a great admirer of Martin Luther King. No, he wasn't. That was a little. It's backwards. Martin Luther King was a great admirer of his because of how he spent time in Harlem and just in solidarity with the black population there in Harlem, and that greatly shaped Dietrich Bonhoeffer when he actually went back and quite famously stood against the Nazi regime in Germany during World War II, which he was subsequently executed for. And so I'm just going to let Bonhoeffer kind of speak for himself on this part. I've got 3 quotes. The last one will be on the screen, so you don't have to put that up yet. But this idea that to be saved is to be free, not to just be free from sin, to be free from our attempts to secure identity in ourselves, but to be free radically for the other. If salvation is anything, it is the freedom, the God-given freedom to embrace those who are other from us, to embrace those who are different from us, and to live for them. So Bonhoeffer, in his own words, he says, "I discovered later, and am still discovering right up to this moment, that it is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. One must completely abandon any attempt to make something of oneself." So you'll hear some of the stuff I've already talked about here. To make something of oneself, whether it be a saint or a converted sinner or a churchman, a righteous man or an unrighteous one, a sick man or a healthy one. By this worldliness, I mean living unreservedly in life's duties, problems, successes, failures, experiences, and perplexities. In doing so, we throw ourselves completely into the arms of God, taking seriously not our own sufferings, but those of God in the world, watching with Christ in Gethsemane. That, I think, is faith, repentance, conversion. That is how we become truly human and a Christian. Going on, he says, encounter with Jesus, the experience that a transformation of all human life is given in the fact that Jesus is there only for others. His being there for others is the experience of transcendence, of divinity. It is only this being there for others, maintained till death, that is the ground of his omnipotence, his omniscience, and his omnipresence. Faith is participation in this being of Jesus, the incarnation, the cross, and the resurrection. Our relation to God is not a religious relationship to the highest, most powerful, and best being imaginable. Remember those ideas of God that we put to death. That is not authentic transcendence. It is not authentic divinity. But our relation to God is a new life in existence for others through participation in the very being of Jesus. The divine is not infinite and unattainable tasks, but the neighbor who is in reach in any given situation. And this last one will be on the screen because I talked about this idea of salvation is a freedom for. Freedom is not a quality of man, nor is it an ability, a capacity, a kind of being that somehow flares up in him. Anyone investigating man to discover freedom finds nothing of it. Why? Because freedom is not a quality which can be revealed. It is not a possession, a presence, an object, nor is it a form of existence, but a relationship and nothing else. In truth, freedom is a relationship between two persons. Being free means being free for the other, because the other has bound me to him, and only in relationship with the other am I free. If sin is a deep separation between God and others, then why wouldn't salvation be the reconciliation, first with God and who God reveals himself to be as the God who exists in solidarity with the suffering? And then beyond that, why wouldn't reconciliation with this God be the simultaneous reconciliation with others? And not just our immediate neighbor, because if you remember when Jesus himself was asked who his neighbor is, he identified the neighbor with the person that his audience would have least seen as the neighbor, the Samaritan, the other. I want to suggest to you today that on a weekend where actual Nazis, like actual Nazis with torches, march through a college campus, that before we have any talk of going to heaven or salvation from the fear of death or apocalypse or anything like that, that the salvation that we truly need is a stripping of security and the sort of God that could be used to defend something like this. The same God that Hitler used to marshal the people of Germany many years ago to slaughter the Jews in the Holocaust, to march across Europe and try to establish a whole continent of white supremacy, a stripping of the power of that God, a putting to death of that God, a simultaneous putting to death of our attempts to be God in our own lives, and a subsequent freeing of ourselves to be radically, unconditionally, wholly available for others, all others, including the other, that who is most other than you. Because I'm a nerd, I have a very relevant clip for this. In the film adaptation of the book The Two Towers, Lord of the Rings, there is a scene where Merry and Pippin, the hobbits, are with Treebeard, the Ent. If you are not familiar with Lord of the Rings, forgive me. Treebeard is a giant talking and moving tree. And basically the hobbits, Merry and Pippin, are trying to convince Treebeard and the Ents, the race of talking, moving trees, to join their cause. And Treebeard very decisively says, we're going to actually weather this war the same way we always have. This doesn't involve us. We're going to kind of do our own thing off to the side here. Basically, he says, we're going to rest in our privilege. And Merry, one of the hobbits, says, but you're part of this world. Falls on deaf ears. Pippin, however, has a good idea, and he leads Treebeard through a certain part of the forest, which leads us up to the kind of the precipice of this scene. So watch with me, and then if it's not obvious, I'll unpack it. Believe it or not, that's actually one of my favorite movie scenes of all time. But what I love about it is Treebeard has privilege. His plan was to sit out this war. It doesn't affect him. It's not his problem. But he is put in a moment where he is completely undone. His attempts to secure himself, his identity, his own safety, apart from the oppression and marginalization of the world around him, is put to death. And he can't do anything other than join the cause. He says, we might be marching to our deaths, but this is what I must do. And he kind of summons the rest of the Ents to do that as well. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting we all march to Charlottesville, and I'm not. But what I am suggesting is that true salvation, a true encounter with God, a true encounter with the divine, strips us, puts to death any attempts for us to sit on the sidelines, any attempts for us to say, I am good, I am fully secure in myself, separate from the other, separate from the marginalized, and it forces us, if we're going to call ourselves Christians, to identify with Christ, who, as we saw in Matthew 25, identifies himself with the other, with the marginalized, with the outsider. So I'm running out of time. I don't want to spend a lot of time with this. This obviously doesn't answer questions about, well, what about a cosmic or historical future? What about heaven and stuff like that? That's a whole nother sermon. I'll leave that to Aaron. But I don't think a lot of these atonement theories are mutually exclusive. And what I wanted to give you today was a way to understand the cross and the resurrection that speaks to the here and now, and it speaks to some of the marginalization, the hate that we're witnessing. I'll leave the future to God. What does it mean for people of other faiths? Once again, talk to Aaron. But at the very least, I think it can tell you this: marginalization, being othered, being looked over, being oppressed, is not unique to Christians, nor is it unique to Westerners. And so I do think there's an opportunity to see the Spirit of God at work in people of all faiths, all ethnicities, all parts of the world. And I think solidarity transcends those same borders. And so you can chew on that when it comes to thinking how this might apply to other faiths. And I think one question that a lot of people ask, and I'll close with this, is, did God kill Jesus? No. We did. People did. Bigots did. Powerful men who were scared of their power being undermined killed Jesus. But did Jesus have to die? Yeah, I think so. Because death, suffering, marginalization is a universal condition for humanity, it seems. And for God to truly identify with us, for God to truly be Emmanuel, the God who is with us and free to be for us, as he reveals in Christ, yeah, God had to die. But in doing so, God put to death our idolatrous assumptions about God, revealed God's self to be truly with us, truly for us, and then through the continuing mediating power of the Spirit, frees us to be truly with and for others. Last thing, I'm going to throw up a slide. These are some resources for those who want to be nerds. Book by Tony Jones, Did God Kill Jesus? It's a great kind of history of atonement theories. Tony and I aren't 100% on the same page on kind of the solution he puts forth, but I think it's helpful, provocative. It's a pretty easy read. Community Called Atonement by Scott McKnight is another good one. Kind of gives you a overview of a lot of atonement theories. From the Blood of Abel by a guy named Matthew DiStefano. Matthew works a lot with the theories of a guy named René Girard, who I think has been incredibly influential for probably everyone else on that list. Girard is French and heady, so I'd start with Matthew if you are interested. The God Who Saves by David Congdon, which I mentioned, and for those of you on a budget, the blog Experimental Theology by Richard Beck. He has done a lot of work on atonement theory from some of the perspectives that I've talked about today, as well as some other interesting areas. You can just Google Experimental Theology, and you'll find it. That's all I got. Let me pray for you guys, and thanks for having me.